All right. Hello, everybody. So, in this video lecture, what I want to talk about a little bit is some of our reading. So, one of the things that we're going to talk about is the reading backpacks versus briefcases. And a big part of this is the sort of the way in which we make judgments about people, situations, etc. Very quickly, based on what we see. And the article, Backpacks versus Briefcases, focuses on what happens when you enter a classroom and you see your instructor for the first time and what judgments that you make about them. So when we think about rhetorical analysis, we're doing something very, very similar. So before we get to backpacks versus briefcases, the reading from Miami University mentions description. What does a text look like? And that's very similar to what a person looks like, as well as where we found the text. Where did we encounter that person? But text also expands to things like who sponsored or published that text and what rhetorical appeals are there and when it was written, all of those things, which we're going to talk about a little bit in this video and in an upcoming video. They also talk about analysis. Why does the author incorporate specific rhetorical appeals? Again, that might be, why does a person dress a certain way for a certain circumstance or a certain event? Also, how things change, right? How do clothes go in or out of style, or what's acceptable or unacceptable? When I started university, and it was quite a while ago, it was still common practice for professors to wear a suit and a tie to class. And that's still common at some colleges and universities, but it's no longer really the accepted norm, at least in the Northwest, where we tend to be a little bit more casual. And then the last thing when we think about rhetorical analysis is effectiveness. How effective is the text? Is it ethical, right? What could we change? So these are the sort of foundations of rhetorical analysis. But let's take a moment and really dive into backpacks versus briefcases a little bit more. Now, in Carroll's article, Backpacks versus Briefcases, they talk specifically about kind of that difference of what we would think of maybe an instructor who comes into class with a backpack, like I do, versus somebody that comes in with a briefcase. How does that subtle change influence our perception of that person? And it's important to think about this sort of analogy between a physical presence of a person and a text, because we make judgments so quickly. Perhaps you've heard this phrase, right? You never get a second chance to make a good first impression. It might be attributed to Oscar Wilde or Will Rogers. It's kind of uncertain. But that idea that first impression is the thing that's going to stick with somebody, right? If your first impression of somebody is that they are rude or mean, that's going to color your interactions with that person, your impression of that person for a very long time to come. And it's interesting too, because we make judgments about people in about 1/10 of a second. That is incredibly quick. I actually didn't think it would be that fast that people make these assumptions, but according to various things I found online, it's consistent. We start to formulate those judgments and opinions of people very, very quickly. So you could think about the first time that you saw me, or the first time that you saw a friend or or not a family member probably, but a partner or something like that, what your judgment was, what your assumptions were. And maybe that changed over time, but you had that first impression or judgment about a person. And the same thing happens with a text. So when we go into backpacks versus briefcases, what we're really talking about with this analogy or metaphor is rhetoric, right? The way we use language and images to persuade, and that's what makes media work. So this is why we might dress differently when we go for a job interview than we would if we were hanging out on the beach. We're using our clothing or appearance to generate an image and to persuade somebody of something, right? That we are confident, that we're professional, etc. Now, I'm going to go into a couple other specific quotes. Some of these are slightly longer, but I want to highlight these things from the text because even if you've read it, I want to underscore what's happening in these quotes. So here's the first one. It's rather long, but I'm going to go ahead and read it out. Because media rhetoric surrounds us, it's important to understand how rhetoric works. If we refuse to stop and think about how and why it persuades us, we can become mindless consumers who buy into arguments about what makes us value ourselves and what makes us happy. For example, research has shown that 2% of women consider themselves beautiful, which has been linked to the way that the fashion industry defines beauty. We are also told by the media that buying more stuff can make us happy. But historical surveys show that U.S. happiness peaked in the 1950s when people saw as many advertisements in their lifetime as the average American sees in 1 year. Now, this is important because we generate our ideas not in a vacuum, but by what we see around us. And we see this in social media. Those of you that have studied social media or, thought about this in depth, that we can suffer, psychologically, emotionally, mentally from seeing all these other people that are leading perfect lives, and that rhetorically, right, by rhetoric, convinces us that we need those things. And this is how advertisements work, right? We want to be a part of something. So rhetoric, if we're not stopping to think about what we're seeing, why we're seeing it, who's bringing that image to us, we can fall into this gap of sort of having skewed views of ourselves or the world around us. Now, Carol also points out that the rhetorical situation, which we've talked about a bit, is just the beginning of an analysis, right? What you really want to understand is the argument, what the rhetor, the speaker or writer, wants you to believe or do, and how he or she goes about that persuasion. And so as we bring together a rhetorical analysis, it's all of the pieces. It's not just a question of what rhetorical strategy somebody is using, but what is the situation in which they're presenting their argument, and what are they doing to convince us, and why do they want to convince us? Do they want to sell us something? Do they want us to vote a certain way? What have you? Now, Carol includes a list of questions. I believe it's towards the end, right? So does the rhetoric address the problem it claims to address? It's not always true that somebody claims something and then supports it, right? This happens a lot. So when we look at a piece, if there's a problem, is the rhetoric actually addressing that problem? 2, is the rhetoric targeted to an audience who has the power to make change? And this is something we'll talk about quite a bit, especially as we get to the persuasive essay, which is, I want to persuade an audience that can do something, either in their lives or in the lives of other people. If somebody can't necessarily do something to change a situation, they may not be the right audience. Are the appeals appropriate to the audience? And again, this goes back to that sort of, even metaphor or analogy of clothing, right? Does it match the situation? If we are talking to, say, a school board, statistics might make more sense than personal appeals. But if we're talking to a friend, statistics are probably not going to be the most effective. Does the rhetor, the speaker or the writer, give enough information for us to make an informed decision? This is important too, right? Depending on somebody's purpose, motive, all of those things in speaking or writing, they might leave out information that's important. We call that cherry picking, right? Only providing us with part of the picture. Does the rhetoric attempt to manipulate us in any way, right? Giving false information, inaccurate information, taking quotes out of context, right? We have to think about how those things are being done, how these strategies are being used, and whether or not they're being used ethically. And what other sub-claims, right? There are main claims and then little claims under that, do we have to accept in order to understand the rhetor's main claim? For example, in order to accept the Ad Council's claim that the arts boost math and science scores, you first have to value boosting of those scores. So this is where, and we'll talk about this in class, when we're speaking to an audience, again, we're never writing or speaking to anyone or for anyone. We have to think about that demographic. We have to think about what they care about, what they believe in, what they value. And that is what's going to make us effective in our speaking, and that we're sharing a value, that we're working together towards some goal. Right. And then they talk about, are there any negative effects that might come from this rhetoric? Right. Can somebody be, in that manipulation, right, standpoint, or encouraging somebody to do something unethical? So just some last thoughts, right? We have to take into account in a rhetorical analysis who is talking or writing, why they're talking, and who they're talking to, right? So it's that speaker, occasion, and audience. We also have to take into account what their purpose is, what they're really trying to persuade the audience of, that specific audience. And then it's also helpful and important to think about whether or not the specific choices were effective. When we're diving into rhetoric, it's easy sometimes to just fall into sort of distant observations. The person used word choice here. They used statistics here. But what is incredibly helpful and will help push your critical thinking skills and your ability to use rhetoric in whatever circumstance is to think about whether or not those choices were intentional and whether or not they were effective, right? Did they get the audience to do something? All right, so there you go. If you have questions, comments, concerns, jokes, memes, or recipes, let me know. Otherwise, I'll see you later.